One of the concepts that you may come across is something called, or it's abbreviated SEM, stands for the standard error of measurement. So once you consider the concept that when you take a test, you get a score. And if you were to take that same test again, probably just within a few minutes, assuming nothing else changes, you'd get a similar score, but probably not the same one. So just like we know groups of students will not get the same score every time, the standard error of the mean indicates that each student individually gets a different score every time. When we look at a group of students and the variation in the scores, that creates a standard deviation, and it also creates a standard error of the mean because as a group, those students are getting different scores. When we look at this individually, the standard error of the mean it really has to do with an individual student and how stable that test is in terms of its capacity to get the same score every time. That stability is called the SEM, and assessments with poor SEM have reliability issues. So I'm going to put this document in D2L, and this is kind of summarizing that same thing again about the standard error of measurement, where that comes from, and how the standard deviation enters into that. And really what I want you to look at is this last part down here. So a SEM is a score that can actually get fairly large if it's bad enough. There's a standard deviation that comes from the scores, and then there's a reliability. Reliability goes on a scale from 0 to 1, 1 being perfectly reliable. So what I want you to notice is when there's a low standard error of the measurement, meaning that what somebody scores the first time doesn't vary much from what they get scored the second time, that generates a fairly small standard deviation, which is going to lend itself to that leptokurtic curve where everything's jammed up in the middle. And look at the reliability score. It's very good. When the standard error of the measurement starts to get larger, look what happens to the standard deviation, and then look what happens to the reliability. If you think about it, it makes sense. Is if there is a great deal of variation within the scores each time somebody takes a test, that's going to increase their standard error of the measurement. Those scores, because the average is used to build the standard deviation, is going to increase your standard deviation. That generates instability and therefore lowers the reliability of it. So this is an important thing to understand, not only in terms of the standard error of the measurement itself, but what that means for the reliability of the assessment. So measurements. There are three ways in which we might want to measure or assess a person. There is a normal distribution, there is a criterion distribution, and there is a assessment of oneself. So normal distribution is something like the GRE exam, where we are comparing one person's score against the scores of other people. A criterion assessment is like an assessment in a math class. Says your score should be a reflection of what you know, and that's it. It doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. And then a self-score, this really is what we use for case studies. If you're assessing yourself on some measure, and it can be if somebody is measuring you from an outside perspective, like if we were analyzing behavior for students identified with special needs and we're trying to identify specific behaviors, there's a way in which we might get the same score every single time. So this would be a GRE exam. This would be a math test, or a STAR test would be another good example. And this is like a behavior assessment. Well, here's the challenge with these, is these are supposed to be treated separately. So my question is are any of these used inappropriately? And the answer is yes. TEA uses these inappropriately. Here's how. And I can think of two examples. The STAR exam is a criterion reference test. There is supposed to be a standard by which students are measured, and if they don't meet that standard, then they're considered a failure. What they consider failure, though, moves. That criteria moves. It moves from one year to the next, and it moves within a year. And it's possible that they have changed this, but at least in the time that I was dealing with this as administrator, the score that they would set for the first assessment was not the score that they would set for the last assessment. So if you're a student who struggled, you're a whole lot better off to take the test on the last time, to keep failing it, and take your test the last time, because the score required for passing the criteria moved and it was lowered. These two things are not supposed to intermix. They're supposed to be set. If you're doing a norm reference test, that's it. If you're doing a criterion, that's it. Another example of this from TEA is when our students take the certification exams to become a teacher, like all of you did. That score moves. That score is moved, and this is a quote from ETS, is back when ETS still had the exam. They told us in a dean's meeting that the score required for passing the EC6 core subjects exam moved. And that's supposed to be a criterion reference test of what is the evidence of that a person has that they are qualified to be a teacher. They told us that they move that criteria based upon the number of teachers that are needed in the state. And what I mean by that is, if there is a time in which we have a teacher shortage, TEA will direct ETS to lower this standard because they don't want it to create a situation where they don't have enough teachers. If there is a situation in which we have too many people that want to be teachers, they'll raise this standard up. And that can move from one year to the next. So again, we have criteria reference scores graded on a norm reference scale. Those two things are not supposed to interact. So I asked the guys at ETS about that, because somebody who works for a testing company ought to know better. And they said, yes, you're right. Those are two things are not supposed to interact, but we're just doing what TEA tells us to do, which is unbelievably unethical, but it is what it is. So other types of assessments that we might have. We have performance assessments. As we mentioned before, that's a t-test with a rubric. There's a rubric that's built in behind that. Even on a performance assessment, validity and reliability are still important. Validity from the standpoint of, if a person does well on a performance assessment, that should mean through some other concurrent validity measure that that person is a good teacher in this case. Reliability is still an important issue, because if you're a good teacher, you should get a good score no matter who is scoring you. The level to which TEA follows up on this to determine the extent that we might use with Cronbach's alpha to determine how reliable these scores are, I have no idea how they follow up on that. Some performance assessments are assessed with a rubric. I don't know the extent to which you have experience with this, but rubrics have become a lot more popular, especially in teacher education programs, because we want to be able to provide some kind of performance assessment on a set of standards that has defined criteria by which students can see how they can do better. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So here's an example of an old rubric from our counseling program. This is a rubric for a self-assessment report. So in a rubric, they're supposed to identify criterion. These are the criterion over here. So in this example, they looked at client description, description of results for assessment, professional objectivity. And then moving across this way, there's supposed to be some level of description about how students are able to present this. So here, the lowest performing one here is client description presenting concerns lacking in detail. Description seems shallow and not fully relevant. Description presenting concerns examined with care. This is not a good rubric. The problem with this rubric is there is no way, this is subjective. Concerns examined with care is a subjective term. And a student looking at this would not know, how do I move from here to here? How do I examine with care better than just being shallow and not fully relevant? That doesn't have any meaning. So I spent a lot of time working with programs about assessment development. And now we've moved to something more like this, which granted is a lot more complicated, but here is the state competency. So the school counseling students have under competency 002 this information. This over here is the lowest performance criteria. So the student does not have an understanding of these, and these, including these criteria. These criteria actually come out of the sub-competencies associated with this. So as a student does better, we're looking for whether or not they can address these concerns that are tied back to this standard. The better they do, there's more things that are included, and the ultimate is to have them addressing all of these issues. So a student, when you evaluate their writing, you can actually see what they are doing poorly at and what they're missing, and the student can too. That's the way rubrics need to be developed, and it takes a long time to be able to get to that point. Other examples are personality inventories, like the Myers-Briggs, that kind of gives you a measure of introvert versus extrovert. It took them about 50 years to develop that, to get it right. Learning style inventories, whether or not somebody's kinesthetic, auditory, tactile, visual, those sorts of things are learning styles. Those take a long time to develop, to make them valid, and if you're having other people use them, to make them reliable. Attitude scales, the job involvement scale that we just described a little while ago. All of these still require measure reliability and validity. All are subject to consequential and face validity. Face validity is basically as the mom test. And really what it comes down to is it doesn't matter how good your validity is. If your mom, so to speak, doesn't think it's a good assessment, you're going to start running into problems of whether or not it'll do what you're supposed to. Very quickly, I'm going to go back to an example. When I was at the University of Arkansas, we were doing a learning style inventory assessment, and we wanted to know if teachers could identify their students' learning styles. And we'd spent a lot of time developing this assessment, and it had things like auditory, kinesthetic, and when we gave that to them, we had a lot of feedback that they said, I don't know what you mean by kinesthetic. So even though we'd spent a lot of time working on this, we made an assumption that the teachers using the learning style inventory knew what kinesthetic meant, and they didn't. So again, there was a consequential validity to that, and face validity that we didn't address, that we should have come up with a better way to identify that. So what's going to happen next? You are going to analyze an assessment. So here's a series of questions that are associated with the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. When you look at this, do not flip out. You do not have to read all 176 pages of this. This is the methodology by which the ITBS was validated. So in order to understand the concepts that we've just discussed, these questions and these bold statements are associated with the document from the ITBS. I want you to work through these questions in a group. It's important that you don't say, well, you take validity, you take standardization, etc. Because you need to understand all these concepts. You need to work on all these questions together, because when we talk about a midterm exam, that's kind of where this thing is going to be coming from.